about him other than he comes all the way from Scottsburg.
You wouldn't even know it.
I wouldn't know it. You made it through the camp process, so you're pretty good.
Yeah, I'm pretty conventional in my beliefs. Come on, guys, I'm not that ugly. You all gotta sit into the back. You're making the guy feel bad. All right, so go on to the first slide there. All right, so why should you believe me? Who are you? How did you get in here? This will kind of explain that. I don't want you to take anything I say tonight just believing it just because. I want to encourage everyone in here to at least look at all of this yourself. I try very hard to make everything I present accurate. I try to read one side, I try to read the other side. I cannot guarantee that, it's as good as I know how to make it, let's say that. But what I'm going to do tonight is just present a lot of information, a lot of very introductory information, so you can go out and read about all of this yourself. Unlike the dog in the picture, I hope I do have some idea of what I'm doing. And because one of my hobbies is, while most people are out just conforming to social norms, I'll go home, I'll study, I'll read as much as I can about history and science and everything related to origins, where do we come from, the resurrection. I just find it immensely fascinating, and I've kind of been on this quest for about 8 years. I'm a software developer, I work for myself, I've got a full-time job doing that, so this isn't what I normally do, but I love speaking about topics like this, so thank you so much for just letting me come up here and do it. All right, next slide. I want to talk a little bit about, before I get into, various evidence of why I think the New Testament is true, just a little bit of background. I grew up in a non-religious home. Nobody was hostile to Christianity, it just didn't really come up. And I think I was probably a teenager before I realized people claimed Jesus even rose from the dead. I don't know how you grew up in the Bible Belt, being so ignorant of Christianity, but somehow I managed. When I was 16, I was in chemistry class in school. I had a teacher tell me, just out of the blue, I mean, she wasn't trying to make a point or anything, that just not all scientists believe in evolutionary theory. And that was complete news to me. I'd never heard such a thing before. So, I was 16 years old. 16-year-olds don't know that much about biology, no matter how much I've thought about myself at the time. So I get online, I read books, I read the books that those books write, and I got to the point where I was convinced that yes, life needs to be designed to work, that there is a designer. Therefore, just because the Bible talks about miracles, I can't dismiss it and say, oh, miracles are impossible. I read Lee Strobel, I read the authors that he cited about the New Testament and reasons why he thinks it's true, and I became convinced. Around the same time, I had friends at school inviting me to church. I attended, had a phenomenal preacher down in Scottsburg at First Christian Church at the time, and I was baptized and became a Christian 18 years ago. So that's my story. I've never had what I would call a spiritual experience. I, of course, pray, I worship, I do all these things, but I've never had, Jesus appear to me. I've never heard an audible voice. I've never had this voice in my head, or however people describe it, saying, yes, this is true. I'm a Christian because I think it's supported by the evidence. If some of you hopefully have had those things happen, that's better than anything I can give you. And I hope maybe one day I can experience that, maybe on this side of life, maybe not, I don't know. But that's where I'm coming from. So, who here knows someone who's not a Christian? Hopefully all of you, right? I mean, we try not to be that isolated. I'll get to that here in a little bit. But I want to talk about, well, if you're sharing with someone who's not a Christian, they haven't had these spiritual experiences, well, what do you tell them? You say, I just have faith that it's true. Well, Muslims, Mormons, Hindus, and most other belief systems can say that, so that doesn't really tell them why, you say, well, because the Bible says, you say, I was raised to believe that, well, they were raised to believe other things. It's true because I like it. I like the idea that pizza doesn't have calories and doesn't make it true, so. I very much don't like the idea of what Kim Jong-un does to his people in North Korea. That doesn't make it not true. And lots of times people with religion, they just kind of put it in a separate category in their mind where if they like God being like this, then that's how God is. If they don't like this idea of God, then that's not how God is. And we can't do that with anything else. I mean, So therefore, you can't just make up God in your own image. You could say, I'm a Christian because the church gives me a family, and the church, and at least my experience in church is that it's very good about giving people a family. I love the people I go to church with, and they love me, but people of other faiths have the same, a microphone now, look at that. Very nice. People in other faiths have the same experience. John Lee Cleary was the former Grand Master Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. I think I call it a Grand Master Wizard. I might be getting the adjectives out of order there. But he joined the Ku Klux Klan because the Klan gave him a family when he didn't have one anywhere else. So it might not be, the one true way to determine truth. And thankfully he left the Klan. He, actually, a black pastor that he met, he was so friendly to him that he gave up the Klan and he became a Christian, and now he goes to this black pastor's church. There's actually some videos on YouTube where he's been on various talk shows talking to people about his story. Amazing story, not what I'm talking about tonight though. I could be a Christian because we should be Christians because Christianity makes us a better person. I fully believe that Jesus has the power to transform our lives. As best I can tell, he did that with me. My ideas of morality are completely different than before I was a Christian. But at the same time, if you're a Muslim, or you're an agnostic or whatever, you become a Muslim and you follow the various statutes of the Quran, then you're going to be a better person according to the Quran. So again, that doesn't really get us to the point where this is why Christianity is true. Number 6, because the Holy Book says, because the Bible says, well, the Mormons who come to say, well, because the Book of Mormon says. So unless you have some other reason to say, well, this is why the Bible's true, this is why the Book of Mormon is false, then you gotta get past that. And actually, there are a lot of good indications that the Book of Mormon is false. That again is another talk. Number 7, because evidence supports it. I'm a fan of this one. I like this one. Usually, if you have two different things, one's true, one's false, usually the evidence will be with the one that's true. We use this methodology in just about everything else in our lives, hopefully, maybe, sometimes. So, if Christianity is true, then we should expect that, God would give us reasons to believe it's true. At least with people who God hasn't spoken to directly. Next slide. So, as you all know, we're commanded to share the gospel, Matthew 28:19. Go into all nations, make them disciples, baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It only happens if I lean down. Look at that. Isn't that neat? Okay. We'll just work with this here. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, we tear down lofty arguments, or we destroy arguments, and every bit of pride to keep anyone from knowing God. We capture people's thoughts and make them obey Christ. So, even if, I would assume most people in this room are already convinced Christians, or some of you here who probably aren't, but I'm very glad you're here. But, if you are a Christian and you already believe all this, not everyone around you does. Not everyone around you has had a direct experience with the Holy Spirit. And, we need ways to, different people have reached different ways. A couple of statistics. 26% of the adults in the United States believe the Bible is an ancient book of fables. In England tends to always, or Europe in general, tends to always be a little more liberal, a little more progressive, a little less Christian than what things are in the United States. 40% of people in England believe Jesus never existed. They would put him in the same category as Hercules or Zeus or any of these other ancient people. And, that we don't see that as much here, but it's growing. And it might be here in another 10 or 20 years. I don't know. I hope it doesn't. Next slide. So, all right. Now we're finally getting to what I'm talking about. 10 points. Wow. That's too many for that cat. Yeah, for those of you who are good at math, you might actually know that this is actually double the points of 5-point Calvinism. But, okay, sorry. Bad jokes. So let's go through all these things. You might not know what some of them are, but we'll get to all that. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, early witness attestation. That means, if you're looking at any set of ancient documents and you're trying to figure out is it reliable or not, there's various criteria you can apply. Well, first of all, was it written by someone who lived on another continent 300 years later. You might have some true things in there, some not. You want the people writing about the historical event at least have a close connection to it. Either they were there themselves or they knew people who were there. So with the New Testament, there's various opinions about when it was written. What are some of the clues that can help narrow it down a little bit? First of all, Paul was killed in the mid-60s, like around 64 AD by Roman Emperor Nero. Paul, I would put Paul's writings before that time, which is the majority of the New Testament. Paul quotes the book of Luke in 1 Corinthians and also 1 Timothy. That puts Luke before the mid-60s. Luke wrote the book of Acts, and Acts also ends before Paul, Peter, and James were killed, and they were all killed in the mid-60s. We actually get this from Josephus and a couple other writers. And Luke, when he wrote the book of Acts, he's writing to Theophilus, and he begins in the very beginning of Acts, talking about his previous book. Well, what's Luke's previous book? It's what we call the Gospel of Luke. Luke quotes from Matthew and Mark repeatedly, which also suggests they were written before Luke. So, some people will say, well, the Bible is just something that was written centuries later, blah, blah, blah. That's not what our historical sources tell us. Our historical sources tell us that it was close to the event. Next slide. A couple other reasons. No book in the New Testament ever directly mentions the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's alluded to in the Gospels when Jesus is talking about his predicted prophecy. But the destruction of Jerusalem was a major event in Judaism and everything around Judaism at that time. The Roman Emperor Titus laid siege to the city. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The temple was destroyed. They stopped the animal sacrifice. The Jews kind of scattered out all away from there, and it never really came back together again for a long time after that. And Matthew especially, whenever Jesus did something and then later it happened, he would always make a point and say, hey, that happened the way Jesus predicted would happen. That doesn't happen anywhere in the New Testament with the destruction of Jerusalem. I think John and Revelation probably were written after 70 AD. There's a lot of Christian scholars that agree with that, but there's just so much there that mentions the temple throughout the New Testament. I feel like writing a book about the history of skyscrapers in New York City. And if this book doesn't mention 9/11, it's probably written before 2001. Also, from 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1, Paul gives us a timeline of how he became a Christian and when, where, and 14 years later, this and that. From that, you can put together that Paul was actually meeting with the disciples in the mid-30s. Jesus would have been crucified around sometime between 30 and 33 AD. And Paul was already discussing the resurrection with them around that time, which, if you're running into someone that says, well, the resurrection is just a myth that they made up later and gradually accumulated through legend and this and that, it's not a good theory, because Paul isn't directly telling us exactly when this happened. It's from different pieces we put together that he was telling different churches that builds this timeline. And that's actually something that almost every single agnostic, atheist, and Jewish historian will agree with, is that the Christians believe Jesus, including Paul and Peter, believe Jesus rose from the dead in the 30s, that it wasn't something that developed over time. Especially, the dating of the New Testament whole is especially important because, if you have a legend, it can't develop while people are still alive who were there, who saw the events happen. Let's say, I have a story about how the animals escaped from the Indianapolis Zoo. They're running down the streets. Rhinoceros are chasing taxis, whatever. If I said this happened 100 years ago, and there's no Google, then you might have a hard time proving or disproving what I'm saying. If I'm saying this happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's not going to catch on because there's people who have been alive in Indianapolis who were there 10, 20, 30 years ago. Same principle here with the New Testament. You're making all these extraordinary claims. Well, it makes it a lot more difficult to get off the ground. Next slide. Public details. If I take my story about the zoo animals, and I say that Mike Pence was there, and he was trying to lasso an elephant. And Larry Bird was there also, and John Mellencamp and Leonard Skinner, they were singing Freebird together. The birds were escaping from the zoo and they're free. This makes my story even less credible because these are people that are widely known. I can go and check Mike Pence's Twitter page and see, is he tweeting about the elephants, or is it, you can find these people, track them down, and see whether or not they can corroborate your story. So if you're making something up, you don't want to put famous people in the story. The Gospels and the book of Acts are full of details about when and where the main characters are at. You have a lot of famous people. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were on the High Council, the Council of 70 that ruled Jerusalem. You got Pontius Pilate there, who was the governor, which who knows what he looks like, but that's the guy from the movie. You have Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa the First or the Second, Caiaphas the high priest, and also, I think Annas was there also, who was the one before him. Gallio the proconsul is one of the ones that ran into Acts. And then toward the end of Acts, Paul is before Felix, the governor of Judea, his wife Drusilla, and then Festus, who succeeded Felix. And if you're making this stuff up, why are you this isn't how you do it. In Acts chapter 2, Peter's addressing the crowd, and he's talking about it as if it's something everyone had seen. He says, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we're all witnesses of it. And he's, according to Acts, he's speaking to a crowd of thousands. Next slide. So sometimes not me, I'm a good person, but someone less scrupulous than me would, I make up a story where I do something stupid and it's just, for humor. That's kind of different than what we see in the Gospels. There's lots of times where, the disciples don't look good. And sometimes Jesus doesn't look good. There's lots of things in there that if you're trying to make your story appeal to as many people as possible, you don't put those things in there. Eat my body and my blood. Those types of things. So, we've got a few examples of this here. The gospel writers recorded when the Jews said Jesus was a madman, a drunkard, a deceiver, and demon-possessed. Jesus' mother and brothers thought he was crazy, and they tried to take hold of him and get him to stop. Jesus was deserted by most of his followers at one point in John 6. That's with my body and my blood. Jesus often told the disciples they're dim-witted or stupid because they didn't understand what he was saying. That's over and over again. Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter's like, the rock on which I built my church, and he's even screwing up these things. This is whenever Peter was telling Jesus, "No, I don't want you to die," before the crucifixion. John the Baptist doubted in Matthew 11 when he was in Herod's prison. He sent his disciples to Jesus to say, "Hey, are you really the Messiah?" And actually, Jesus cited evidence in response. He said, I've done these miracles. The lame walk, the blind see, and the good news is preached to the poor. Well, that one's not quite miraculous, but the others are. Okay, Jesus let a prostitute wipe his feet with her hair, Luke 7:36. There's no way someone's going to misconstrue that or try and build an accusation about that, right? If Luke is just trying to present a Jesus that's acceptable to everyone, he's going to say, guys, we've got to leave this part out. People are going to get the wrong idea here. No, he even included that part. He seems to have had very little regard for what people are going to do with this, and a very high regard for just recording what happened. So, you don't see those types of reactions. The disciples fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus was about to be arrested. And this is another time when he's angry at them, saying, "Why can't you at least stay awake?" The next slide. Right after that, the disciples abandoned Jesus in fear. Peter denies Christ after he swears up and down that he's not. And hey, that's recorded in Mark. Where did Mark get his information? Well, according to Papias, Mark got his information from Peter. So Peter is actually telling Mark what happened. Mark writes this down in his gospel. And that stupid situation where Peter embarrassed himself made it all, he even tells people about it. Jesus was flogged and crucified, which, is not what you expect to happen to your Messiah. That is not what anyone expected to happen to the Savior of Israel. Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. If you're making this stuff up, or maybe Jesus did get himself crucified and you want to change the story, you're not going to make that the central point of your message. But all four Gospels talk about the crucifixion. They go through details, and Paul even said that this is the stumbling block, Christ's crucifixion. Okay, number 11. Women are first witnesses to the empty tomb. This doesn't make sense in our society today, but at the time, women were considered less credible witnesses than men. If you're going to make up a story, you want it to be credible, you're not going to pick women to be the first witnesses. But if you're writing down history and it really happened that way, then you're just going to write whatever actually happened. Josephus was a Jewish historian. I think he was writing around the year 90 AD. Thereabouts. I'd have to look it up again. One of the things that he wrote was, let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of their levity and boldness of their sex, which means their gender. And I believe the Jewish Talmud, which was kind of their commentary on the Old Testament, they had similar statements about trusting women. So Matthew tells us the Jews are going around telling people the disciples stole the body. If you're trying to get your story across and get people to accept it, you're not going to include, the claims that, other people are making against you. Or maybe you will if they really happen, but then, of course, if they're making those claims, then that also means the tomb was empty. You don't say the dog ate my homework if you got your homework. Paul, after Stephen's death in the book of Acts, he planned to kill Christians. And then in the book of Acts, Luke actually shares the different disputes that the early church is having. We have these non-Jewish people called Gentiles coming into the church. Do they have to follow all of the Jewish law? Do they have to do this? Do they have to do that? If you're making a brochure for your church, you don't put all your arguments in there. But if you're trying to just tell everything as it happened and not redacting anything, the whole story, then yes, you do. So let's go to the next slide here. The New Testament writers get difficult details correct. I've seen people give like 1.5 hour talks just on this particular topic, and actually most of the others I'm talking about tonight. Many of them you can find a whole book written about them. Sometimes multiple books. Sometimes 800-page books. And like I said, this is just an introduction. So one example of getting the difficult details right is in Acts 13 through 28. Whenever Paul is traveling all around the Mediterranean on his missionary journeys, and Luke is with him for at least part of that period. So when they're traveling around, they get the proper names of all the various ports right. They know the local industries of the various regions, the proper line boundaries. They know the slang terminology in the different places they go. For example, spermologos was in the city of Athens. That was what they would call someone who just babbles on and on. This is what they called Paul. This was a specific term for that city. There's no Google in the first century. You can't, really look up this stuff. So it's very, very difficult to get this stuff right unless you're actually doing the things that you're describing and going to these places. We have examples of later documents where, people were, inventing various stories, and they get all kinds of historical details wrong about the times that they purport to write for. And this is one of the criteria we use to tell the difference between early writings and late writings. I think the life of Apollonius is one of those examples of a late writing where he gets the various kings. I think he has kings in Babylon when Babylon was already destroyed long before then. And I don't remember the other details. Okay, more difficult details. The specific landmarks, local variations in language, beyond just spermologos, that should probably be the same point. Proper titles for regional and local officials. I'm going into detail on this one. For example, in Acts, the person in charge is called a proconsul. In Philippi, you got a governor. In Thessalonica, they got politarchs. In Ephesus, they have a town clerk. In Malta, they have a chief man. In Athens, the members of the council are called Areopagites. And also you have, and Gallio was the proconsul in Corinth. And That's actually something we've dug up. We have a tablet from Corinth with Galileo's name on it there. I don't speak Greek. I'm not even very good at pretending to speak Greek, but I trust the sources I got that from. There's literally hundreds of examples like that, and I'm not going to go through all of them tonight. So, useless details. What is this? These are verses that have no theological or spiritual significance. Luke 8, in the beginning, he names a list of women who followed Jesus around. Mark 15, he says, Simon of Cyrene was the father of Alexander and Rufus. These are not major characters. They don't really go on to do much else. I think one of them is maybe mentioned one other time in the whole New Testament. It's off the cuff remark. John 20, John ran faster than Peter, arrived at the tomb first. Peter was the first to go inside. 1 Corinthians and a lot of his Paul's letters, Paul tells the people he's talking to, hey, I'm going to be here at this time, I'm going to visit. 2 Timothy, Paul says, hey, bring my cloak and my scrolls. I forget my Bible at church all the time. I understand exactly where Paul's coming from. So why does this matter? Why is this evidence of, that this is signs of accuracy? Well, first of all, if it was written down in one period of time, and later you have, dishonest priests or scribes or whatever who are copying these documents and they want to insert their own theology. They don't like this group of people, so they're going to put words in Paul's mouth speaking against them. Or maybe they just don't really care that much about the accuracy and they're just going to copy the parts they like and they care about. Why is all this in here? That all of these otherwise useless details, useless except for to the people who were alive at the time, who Paul needs them to bring his cloak and his scrolls. Or, hey, I know that woman is following Jesus because, she's a friend of mine. Not only does it kind of put it early, but it shows that you have accurate preservation because they're preserving the parts that no one should even care about. Not only that, anyone ever in school have to write a bunch of sentences by hand? Try writing the whole New Testament. Is that going to be fun? Are you gonna take shortcuts? Are you gonna leave the parts out that aren't gonna matter? They didn't even do that. Papyrus was expensive at the time. I've heard some people say that the papyrus, the length of Mark's gospel would cost like 1 or 2 days' wages. And then if you couldn't write, you had to hire a scribe. Also, you had to buy the ink. Nobody had tables for some reason. They never really thought of that until much later in history. I don't know why, but it's not an easy process. It's not a cheap process. But we have all these useless details there anyway. And that shows us that the people who were copying it had a very, very high regard for what they were copying and seemed to care very much about keeping it accurate. Next one. Common names. This is actually something that wasn't discovered until 2003. But I'll get to that in a minute. So this is a list of the most popular Jewish names mentioned on ossuaries. An ossuary is a bone box that they would put people in after the body decayed. They'd take out the bones, they'd put it in a box and bury it again in Jerusalem, in that area. So these are the most common names they found written on ossuaries, written on graves, and the most common names they found in the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian, from the 1st century also. And as you can see, Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, they were the most common names. Not only that, but the most common names on these other things that we see in that place and time period are usually pretty close to being the most common names in the New Testament. For example, Lazarus was the first most common name in the New Testament, but it's the 3rd most common name overall. Go next slide. If you go over to Egypt and get Jewish male names from Egypt, at the same time period, you get a different story mostly. Eliezer was the 3rd most common name, Joseph was the 2nd most common name, but you have all these others here. So this is just another thing that tells us that the information we're getting that goes into the Gospels is coming out of Jerusalem in the 1st century. It's not someone else over and wherever making it up. You know, I mean, if I ask you to say, hey, tell me some of the most common men's names in Mexico 100 years ago, you're all going to pull out your phones, right? They didn't have phones, and they didn't really have any way of knowing that. Okay, not only that, next slide, but the most common names have qualifiers. You know, if you're in school or whatever, and there's two people named James, you say James Brown or James this guy. We see the same pattern in the New Testament, and that the most common names have the qualifiers, the little extra information attached. For example, this is just one verse you can do this with. You can find this all over the place. Matthew 10, verses 2 through 4. Simon, most common name, number 1 there. And they say Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee. James is a common name, and John his brother. Philip and Bartholomew. Philip and Bartholomew are not common names, so they just say Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas, it's so rare that we don't even know how common it is, so it's got a question mark there. And Matthew the tax collector. Everybody liked tax collectors, so he's probably not too happy. Well, I guess he's writing this about himself, so, you know. So, you know, Matthew's the 9th most common name. He's got the qualifier there. And you go on with that. You see it also, Matthew 26, Peter says, or the girl says to Peter, you are Jesus from Galilee. Next slide. And I'm not going to go through all of these. And we see it with Jesus also. We have found the one that Moses, the law, and the prophets wrote about, Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And generally, once you see Jesus introduced as a character, then it'll just keep referring to him as Jesus because the person reading it already knows who you're talking about. This is different than later writings that we know were written later. They just call him Jesus or Christ because at that point the name was very well known. Everyone knew who he was. The qualifiers weren't necessary. So this is just yet another indicator that, you know, not only people were there, but they were written. All this material is coming very close to the events. Undesigned coincidence is point number 7. This is when you see new pieces of information emerging, when you put together different pieces from different sources. For example, say one of your friends says, I saw Billy has a black eye today. And then another friend says, I saw Billy steal Fred's lunch today. Well, who can tell me how Billy got the black eye? Fred punched him, more likely than not. We see the same pattern in the New Testament, and we're very fortunate to have multiple sources so we can actually do this and build this kind of thing. So, you know, in the books of Matthew and Mark, we read about the death of John the Baptist when he's in Herod's household. And we have all these details, even what Herod's saying to his servants. Well, I mean, how do the gospel writers know this? Surely they're just making it up to make a good story, right? Luke, verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 3, you know, I mentioned the list of women earlier. Well, in that list, we have Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager. And Luke doesn't list this